Everything you were taught about the Americas before Columbus was wrong. Not slightly wrong. Not a little oversimplified for a fifth-grade classroom. Wrong in the way that changes everything. Wrong in the way that, once you understand it, you cannot look at American history, American identity, or American land the same way ever again. What if the most consequential act of erasure in human history wasn't the burning of a library, or the silencing of a voice, or the banning of a book, but the invention of a myth? A myth so powerful, so useful to those in power, so deeply embedded into the story a nation told about itself, that it became invisible. Not a lie you could point to, a lie that became the air you breathed. Here is that myth. In 1492, Christopher Columbus sailed west from the coast of Spain and discovered a new world. A vast, wild, largely untouched continent. A wilderness. Beautiful, perhaps. Formidable, certainly. But empty in the ways that mattered. Empty of civilization. Empty of history. Empty of the things that Europeans recognized as the marks of a truly developed human society. That is the myth. And now, here is the truth. When Columbus's ships finally touched land in the Caribbean on October the 12th, 1492, the Americas were home to somewhere between 40 million and 100 million human beings. Scholars debate the exact number, but no serious historian today debates what those people had built. They had built cities, some of the largest cities on the face of the earth. They had built roads that stretched for tens of thousands of miles across mountains, jungles, and deserts. They had built trade networks that moved goods from the Arctic tundra to the tip of South America. They had independently invented the mathematical concept of zero. They had mapped the stars with a precision that would not be matched in Europe for another century. They had cultivated the land so thoroughly, so ingeniously, so sustainably, that the landscapes Europeans would later call pristine wilderness were in fact the carefully managed gardens of civilizations that have been growing for thousands of years. Columbus did not discover a new world. He stumbled, unprepared and largely uncomprehending, into a very old one. This documentary is the story of that world. It is the story the Americas were telling about themselves long before anyone from across the Atlantic arrived to interrupt it. It is one of the greatest untold stories in the history of human civilization. And it begins not with a ship on the horizon, but with a question. How do you make 60 million people disappear? Not physically, not all at once. You make them disappear from the story. You erase them from the page before the page is even written. You look at a continent teeming with life and declare it legally, philosophically, and in the historical record, effectively empty. You give the emptiness a name. You give it a legal doctrine, and you let that doctrine do its work across centuries. The doctrine was called Terra Nullius, Latin for nobody's land. It was the legal and philosophical framework that European colonial powers used to justify the seizure of land occupied by indigenous peoples across the globe. The argument, stripped of its Latin dressing, was brutally simple. If the people living on the land did not use it in the way Europeans recognized, if they did not build fences or plow fields in straight rows, or hold individual title deeds, or worship in the right way, or organize their societies in ways that looked familiar to a European eye, then the land was, legally speaking, unoccupied. It belonged to no one. And land that belongs to no one can be claimed by whoever arrives with a flag and a priest. Terra Nullius was not simply a legal trick. It was a story, and like all powerful stories, it needed to be told over and over again until it became something people simply assumed was true. It needed to be told in official documents and royal proclamations. It needed to be told in the journals of explorers, in the sermons of missionaries, in the paintings of artists who depicted the New World as a kind of Eden before the fall. Lush, timeless, and waiting. It was told in schools. For generations of American children, the story of Columbus and the New World was a story of arrival, of beginning, of a blank slate upon which something new and magnificent could be written. The people who were already there appeared in this story the way furniture appears in a room before the real occupants move in. Present, perhaps, but not quite part of the story that mattered. And the most insidious thing about this myth is not that it was invented. Myths are always invented. The most insidious thing is how durable it became, how long it lasted, how thoroughly it infiltrated not just popular culture and political rhetoric, but the discipline of scholarship itself. For most of the 19th century and well into the 20th, academic estimates of the pre-Columbian population of the Americas were strikingly, suspiciously low. The numbers that appeared in textbooks range from roughly 1 million to 8 million people for all of North America. The implication was clear, even when it wasn't stated outright. There wasn't much here to begin with. What Columbus encountered was, if not a true wilderness, something close enough to justify the language of discovery. Those numbers were not produced by careful scholarship. They were produced by a scholarly culture that could not, or would not, see what the evidence was pointing toward. The person who most decisively broke this open was a man named Henry Dobbins. Dobbins was an anthropologist who spent decades studying the records left by early Spanish missionaries and colonial administrators in the Americas. What he found, buried in those records, was a story of catastrophe so enormous that the academic world initially refused to accept it. Everywhere the Spanish went in the early 1600s, Dobbins found evidence of massive, rapid population collapse. Villages that early missionaries described as crowded and thriving were, within a generation or two, empty. Vast agricultural fields had gone to seed. Communities that early accounts described in the hundreds of thousands have been reduced to tens of thousands. The speed and the scale of the collapse was, by any historical measure, without parallel. The cause was not primarily war. It was not enslavement, though both played their part. The primary cause was disease. Specifically, it was the suite of old-world epidemic diseases, smallpox, measles, typhus, influenza, and others that crossed the Atlantic with European explorers and ran through indigenous populations that had no inherited immunity whatsoever. These were diseases that Europeans had been living with for centuries. They were brutal in Europe, certainly. The Black Death alone had killed perhaps a third of Europe's population in the 14th century. But Europeans who survived carried some degree of inherited resistance. The peoples of the Americas had none. They had been separated from the Old World for at least 15,000 years. They had never encountered these pathogens. And when those pathogens arrived, the results were catastrophic on a scale that is almost impossible for the modern mind to absorb. Dobbins's research, published in 1966, argued that the pre-Columbian population of the Americas was not 8 million. It was not even 40 million. His estimates, which other scholars would refine and debate over the following decades, put the number as high as 112 million people in the Western Hemisphere before contact. Other scholars came in with lower estimates. But the direction of the consensus was unmistakable. The population of the pre-Columbian Americas was orders of magnitude larger than anyone had been taught to believe. And here's the thing that changes everything. The devastating wave of epidemic disease did not wait for European settlers to arrive in North America. It ran ahead of them. Smallpox, in particular, could travel from person to person through trade networks and overland contact far faster than any European expedition could move. Historians and epidemiologists now believe that epidemic disease was sweeping through the interior of North America decades before European settlers from England or France ever laid eyes on most of the continent. When the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth in 1620, they settled land that local tribes had already described as strangely depopulated. They interpreted this as a sign of divine providence. They were, in a way that they never understood, correct. The land had been cleared for them, not by God, by smallpox, by a catastrophe that had already done its work. The scholar William Denevan, a geographer whose landmark work on pre-Columbian populations transformed the field, gave this phenomenon a name that captures its tragic irony perfectly. He called it the pristine myth. The idea that the wilderness Europeans encountered in North America from the 1600s onward was a natural, undisturbed landscape is a myth. Not because Europeans invented it as a deliberate lie, but because they arrived after the catastrophe had already erased the evidence. They looked at a post-apocalyptic landscape and saw Eden. The forests that William Bradford and the Puritan settlers described as a hideous and desolate wilderness in 1620 were not an ancient, untouched wilderness. They were a reclaimed landscape. Fields that had been cleared and cultivated for centuries were reverting to forest. Villages that had housed thousands were silent. Trails that had once been busy with trade and communication were fading back into the undergrowth. The silence was not primordial. It was the silence of the aftermath. The journalist and author Charles Mann brought much of this scholarship to a wide popular audience with his landmark 2005 book 1491, New Revelations of the Americas Before Columbus. It was, for many readers, a genuine shock. The world Mann described, populous, sophisticated, deeply connected, and in many ways more environmentally intelligent than the civilization that replaced it, bore almost no resemblance to the vague image of scattered tribes and untamed wilderness that most Americans had absorbed from their education. Mann described the Americas of 1491 not as a primitive world on the verge of being uplifted by contact with European civilization, but as a fully realized, extraordinarily complex world in the middle of its own history. A world with its own great debates, its own political struggles, its own scientific achievements, its own sense of the past and the future. This is the world we're going to spend the next hour and a half exploring. Not through the lens of the Europeans who eventually arrived and wrote the accounts that shaped Western understanding. Through the lens of what the archaeology, the anthropology, the genetics, and crucially, the surviving indigenous traditions themselves reveal about a world of stunning achievement and breathtaking scale. In the acts ahead, we are going to stand in the ruins of Cahokia, a city in present-day Illinois that, at its peak around the year 1100, housed more people than London. We are going to walk the streets of Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital, a city of 200,000 to 300,000 people built on a lake in the Valley of Mexico. A city that left Spanish soldiers speechless when they first saw it, certain they were dreaming. We are going to follow the trade routes of the Hopewell peoples, who moved copper and shells and obsidian across a network spanning thousands of miles of eastern North America 2,000 years ago. We're going to look from above at the engineered landscapes of the Amazon, where ancient peoples created the dark, rich soil known as terra preta and built geometric earthworks visible from the sky. And we're going to stand in the final act on the eve of October the 12th, 1492, and take a clear-eyed look at what was there, what was really there, and what was lost. But before we can see any of that clearly, we have to understand one more thing about the myth we are dismantling. The myth of the empty wilderness was never simply a historical error. It was never just a case of scholars getting the numbers wrong and then correcting them when better evidence arrived. It was, and in many places continues to be, a story with consequences. It was the story that made conquest feel like cultivation. It was the story that made theft feel like settlement. It was the story that turned the greatest land seizure in human history into something that could be taught to children as an adventure. Understanding where that story came from, understanding how deliberately it was constructed and how tenaciously it has been defended, is not an academic exercise. It is an act of honesty. And honesty, when it comes to this history, has a way of feeling almost revolutionary. Because here's what the honest story looks like. In 1492, two worlds met. One of them was already ancient, already complex, already home to tens of millions of people living in ways that range from nomadic and seasonal to fully urban and imperial. The other world arrived by ship, carrying flags and diseases and a set of stories about itself that left almost no room for the world it was encountering to be truly seen. This documentary is an attempt to see it, clearly, fully, without apology. What Columbus never found was not hidden from him because it was absent. It was hidden from him because he never had the eyes to see it. He was looking for a passage to Asia. He was looking for gold. He was looking for a world that fit the story he already carried inside him. And so the world that was actually there, ancient, extraordinary, and fully alive, passed before his eyes like a continent he simply chose not to discover. We're going to discover it now. To understand what was truly at stake in 1492, you have to understand what kind of world the Americas had built. And the place to begin is with the cities. Because the Americas, in the centuries before Columbus, were building cities that would have stopped any European in their tracks. Cities that rivaled, and in some cases exceeded, anything standing in Europe at the time. Cities of stone and water and light, teeming with life, humming with commerce, organized with a sophistication that defies the myths we have just dismantled. The first of those cities sits not in Mexico, not in Peru, not in the jungle, but right here in the heartland of America, across the river from what is now St. Louis, Illinois. And its name was Cahokia. Close your eyes for a moment and picture a great city. Picture the noise of it, the density of it, the smell of cooking fires and river water, and thousands of human bodies living in close proximity. Picture the movement, people carrying goods to market, children running through narrow streets, priests ascending the steps of a great monument at the center of it all. Picture the ambition of it, the sheer human audacity of deciding, in the middle of a continent, that this place, right here, would be where civilization planted its flag and said, "We are building something that will last." Now open your eyes, because the city you just imagined existed. It existed right here, in the middle of North America, centuries before anyone in Europe had the faintest idea it was there. And the story of how it was built, how it thrived, and how it has been overlooked for so long is one of the most extraordinary stories this continent has to tell. We're going to visit 4 cities in this act, 4 cities from 4 different corners of the pre-Columbian Americas. And by the time we are done, the word primitive will have lost its meaning entirely. Stand on the eastern bank of the Mississippi River in present-day Illinois, just across the water from where the Gateway Arch now rises against the St. Louis skyline. It is the year 1100 of the Common Era. It is 4 centuries before Columbus. And what you're looking at, spread across the flat floodplain before you, is one of the great cities of the medieval world. Its name, the name we use today, comes from a later group of people who lived in the area long after the city had been abandoned. The original inhabitants left no written records that have survived. We do not know what they called themselves. We do not know what they called their home. What we do know, with increasing certainty from decades of painstaking archaeology, is what they built. At its peak, the urban core of Cahokia covered an area of roughly 6 square miles. Within that core, archaeologists have identified more than 120 earthen mounds, platforms, pyramids, ridges, and cones of deliberately packed earth, each one the product of an enormous organized labor force moving millions of cubic feet of soil by hand, basket by basket, year after year. At the center of the city stood, and still stands today, a structure that stops every serious archaeologist in their tracks the first time they see it. It is called Monk's Mound, named not for the people who built it, but for a group of French Trappist monks who farmed its slopes in the early 1800s, centuries after its builders were gone. Monk's Mound rises to a height of 100 feet. It covers an area of 14 acres at its base. And here is the number that tends to silence a room. Monk's Mound is larger at its base than the Great Pyramid of Giza. Let that settle for a moment. In the middle of what is now Illinois, more than 900 years ago, a civilization built a monument larger at its footprint than one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. They built it without metal tools, without the wheel, without draft animals. They built it with human hands, human backs, human baskets, and a degree of social organization that staggers the imagination. Atop this massive platform stood a large wooden building, almost certainly the residence or ceremonial hall of Cahokia's paramount ruler, that would have been visible for miles across the surrounding floodplain. But Monk's Mound is not the whole of Cahokia. It is only the most visible piece of it. The city was planned, not improvised, not organic, not the accidental accumulation of huts around a water source, but deliberately laid out according to an urban design that archaeologists are still working to fully understand. The great central plaza that fronted Monk's Mound covered nearly 50 acres of open, deliberately level ground. This was not a natural clearing. It was engineered. Tens of thousands of cubic yards of earth were moved to create a flat, open civic space where tens of thousands of people could gather. To the west of Monk's Mound stood a remarkable structure that archaeologists have nicknamed Woodhenge. It was a series of large red cedar posts arranged in a circle, and its alignment with the rising sun at the spring and fall equinoxes was precise. This was not coincidence. The builders of Cahokia were tracking the movements of the sun with a sophistication that served both agricultural and ceremonial purposes. They knew where they were in the year. They were marking it in wood and earth and human effort. The residential neighborhoods of Cahokia stretched outward from the monumental core. Archaeologists have found evidence of thatched wooden houses arranged in rows around smaller plazas, with storage pits, cooking facilities, and evidence of specialized craft production. Cahokia was not simply a ceremonial center that people visited seasonally. People lived there. Families, artisans, administrators, priests, warriors, all the specialized social roles that define urban life. At its peak population, estimates for the Cahokia urban core range from 10,000 to 20,000 people. The greater metropolitan region, the surrounding towns, villages, and farmsteads that fed the city and were organized around it, may have housed as many as 50,000 people, with some estimates pushing toward 100,000. To put that in the context of its time, London in the year 1100 had a population of roughly 15,000 people. Cahokia was, by most reasonable estimates, larger, and Cahokia was not an isolated anomaly. It was the apex of an entire cultural world. Archaeologists call it the Mississippian tradition, a broad pattern of mound building, corn agriculture, and complex political organization that spread across much of the southeastern and midwestern United States from roughly 800 to 1600 of the Common Era. From Oklahoma to Georgia, from Wisconsin to the Gulf Coast, dozens of Mississippian towns and cities rose and fell, each one connected to the others through trade, ceremony, warfare, and the movement of ideas. Cahokia was at the center of this world. It was the place that all the roads led to and from. The place where the great rivers of the continent converged. The place where if you were a trader or a pilgrim or a diplomat from anywhere in the eastern half of North America, you eventually came. Why did it fall? That question haunts everyone who studies Cahokia. By the time European diseases began rippling through North America in the 1500s, Cahokia had already been abandoned for more than a century. The city reached its peak around 1100 and declined through the 1200s, largely empty by 1250 or 1300. Why? The honest answer is that we do not know with certainty. Climate change likely played a role. A series of prolonged droughts in the Mississippi Valley would have strained the agricultural system that fed the city. Environmental degradation, the result of clearing vast areas of forest for agriculture and construction, may have reduced the productivity of the surrounding land. Political instability, conflict with neighboring peoples, and the fragility of a highly centralized power structure all likely contributed. What is clear is that Cahokia's decline was not simple or swift. It was the kind of complex, multi-generational unraveling that has brought down great cities on every continent in every era of human history. The complexity of that decline is, in its own way, a testament to Cahokia's greatness. You do not have a complex, multi-generational decline unless you first build something genuinely complex and great. Cahokia is there today. You can visit it. It is a UNESCO World Heritage Site just outside St. Louis, yet most Americans who drive past it on the interstate highway have no idea what they are looking at. That invisibility is itself a kind of legacy of the myth we discussed in Act 1. Monk's Mound sits in a state park in Illinois, visited by a fraction of the people who cross the river to see the Gateway Arch every year. The arch was built to celebrate westward expansion. The mound it faces was built by the civilization that westward expansion erased. Now we leave the Mississippi Valley and travel south and west, across 2,000 miles and 1,000 years, to a different city. A city so large, so old, and so powerful that the people who came after it, people who built their own magnificent civilization centuries later, still spoke of it in hushed, reverent tones. They called it the place where the gods gathered to create the sun. They called it Teotihuacan. The ruins of Teotihuacan sit about 30 miles northeast of present-day Mexico City. They receive millions of visitors each year. And yet most of those visitors leave without fully grasping what they have seen. They climb the Pyramid of the Sun, marvel at the view, take their photographs, and go home. They have stood in the heart of one of the greatest cities in the history of the ancient world and experienced it as a tourist attraction. At its height, between roughly 300 and 500 of the Common Era, Teotihuacan was one of the largest cities on Earth. Population estimates range from 100,000 to 200,000 people. To put that in context, Rome at the height of its power had a population of roughly 1 million. But Rome was Rome, the capital of the empire that defined Western civilization. Teotihuacan was in Mexico. It had been there, humming and building and trading and thinking, while the Roman Empire was still in its infancy. And it was enormous. The city was laid out on a precise grid. Its central artery, the Avenue of the Dead, ran for more than a mile and a half through the heart of the city, flanked on both sides by temples, palaces, and civic structures of extraordinary scale. The name Avenue of the Dead was given to it by the Aztecs, who arrived in the region centuries after Teotihuacan had fallen and assumed that the great platforms lining the avenue were tombs. They were wrong. They were platform temples and administrative structures. But the name stuck. At the northern end of the Avenue of the Dead stands the Pyramid of the Moon. Rising to a height of about 140 feet, its staggered terraces and broad central staircase still commanding after 1,500 years. Further down the avenue, dwarfing everything around it, is the Pyramid of the Sun, with a base measuring 738 feet on each side and a height of 216 feet. The Pyramid of the Sun is one of the largest structures ever built in the ancient world. It was constructed, archaeologists believe, in a single sustained building campaign sometime in the 1st century of the Common Era. The sheer quantity of labor required to move, compact, and surface the estimated 1,200,000 cubic meters of fill that make up its core suggests a city already operating at a high level of social organization even before it reached its peak. But the pyramids, magnificent as they are not the most revealing thing about Teotihuacan. The most revealing thing is what archaeologists found in the apartment compounds. Teotihuacan was not a city of palaces and hovels. It was a city of apartments. Hundreds of multi-room apartment complexes, each one housing between 60 and 100 people, have been excavated across the city's footprint. These were not cramped, improvised shelters. They were carefully constructed, well ventilated, and decorated. The walls of many apartment compounds are covered in elaborate painted murals, scenes of rain gods and feathered serpents and agricultural abundance and ritual ceremony, painted with a sophistication and a sureness of hand that speaks to a culture with a deep artistic tradition and the social stability to invest in beauty for its own sake. What the apartment compounds also reveal is something even more surprising. Teotihuacan was cosmopolitan. Among the hundreds of compounds that have been excavated, archaeologists have identified distinct enclaves, neighborhoods where people from other cultures lived. There's a Zapotec quarter where people from the valley of Oaxaca, hundreds of miles to the south, lived, maintained their own burial customs, and kept their own cultural identity within the larger fabric of the city. There is evidence of a Gulf Coast enclave. The city drew people from across Mesoamerica and gave them a place to live, to trade, and apparently to maintain something of their own identity within its walls. That is, by any definition, a cosmopolitan and sophisticated urban culture. Teotihuacan's economy was industrial. Its craftspeople produced obsidian tools, knives, blades, and points made from the volcanic glass that was the sharpest cutting material available in the pre-Metal Americas, on a scale that can only be described as mass production. Archaeologists have found evidence of hundreds of obsidian workshops within the city, producing standardized products for export across Mesoamerica. Teotihuacan ceramic has been found as far away as Guatemala and Honduras. Its artistic and religious iconography, particularly the image of the feathered serpent, the deity we know as Quetzalcoatl, spread to virtually every major civilization in Mesoamerica and left an imprint that lasted for 1,000 years after the city itself had fallen. Why did Teotihuacan fall? Around 650 of the Common Era, the city suffered a catastrophic event that left a layer of burning and destruction across many of its public monuments. Whether this was an internal uprising, an external invasion, or some combination is still debated. What is clear is that the city was deliberately torched, not the residential quarters, interestingly, but the civic and ceremonial core. The Avenue of the Dead, the pyramids, the palaces of the ruling class. These were the targets of whatever violence ended the city's 600-year run at the center of Mesoamerican civilization. The people did not all leave immediately. Teotihuacan continued to be inhabited in a reduced form for centuries. But as a great power, as the city that organized and directed the culture of a continent, it was finished. Its cultural legacy, however, was immortal. The Aztecs, who built their empire in the Valley of Mexico 700 years later, treated the ruins of Teotihuacan as sacred ground. Their creation myth held that the gods had gathered here to create the current age of the world. They made pilgrimages to it. They built offerings into its pyramids. And when the Spanish arrived and asked the Aztecs about the great ruins outside their capital, the Aztecs said they did not know who had built them. They were simply the work of gods, or of giants, or of a people so ancient that memory could not reach them. The civilization that had built one of the greatest cities in human history had passed beyond the reach of recorded memory in just 7 centuries. It left behind 200 square kilometers of ruins and a cultural imprint that shaped everything that came after it. Now travel east into the lowland jungles of southern Mexico, Guatemala, and Belize, and set aside everything you think you know about the Maya. The popular image of the Maya, even among educated Americans, tends to be something like this: a mysterious, exotic civilization, great temples in the jungle, a brilliant calendar that somehow predicted the end of the world in 2012, a prediction that, it should be noted, the actual Maya never made. Astronomers and mathematicians, certainly, but remote, isolated, ultimately mysterious. Every part of that image needs to be revised. The Maya were, first and foremost, city people, not temple builders in the jungle, but urban dwellers living in densely populated cities that were connected to each other by roads, by trade, by political alliance, and by a written language, one of only a handful of fully developed writing systems independently invented in all of human history. The Maya world at its classic period peak, between roughly 250 and 900 of the Common Era, was home to dozens of major cities and hundreds of smaller towns and villages spread across an area roughly the size of the American Southwest. The largest of these cities were enormous by any standard. Tikal, in present-day Guatemala, had a population at its height of somewhere between 60,000 and 90,000 people. Caracol, in Belize, may have housed as many as 150,000 people in its greater metropolitan area. Calakmul, in what is now the Mexican state of Campeche, was a political and military superpower that competed with Tikal for dominance over the entire Maya lowland region for centuries in a rivalry of such complexity and duration that Mayanists sometimes compare it to the Cold War. This was not a simple, uniform civilization. The Maya were not an empire. They were something closer to what the Greeks were in the classical Mediterranean. A group of related city-states sharing a common culture, a common writing system, and a common religious framework, but politically independent, frequently at war with each other, and capable of extraordinary intellectual and artistic achievement precisely because of the creative energy that comes from competition and exchange. And what achievement it was! The Maya writing system, now largely decoded thanks to the painstaking work of epigraphers over the past several decades, was capable of recording everything from historical narratives and royal genealogies to astronomical observations and philosophical reflections. The Maya wrote on stone stele, on the plastered walls of temples, on ceramic vessels, and in folding books made of bark paper called codices. When the Spanish arrived in the 16th century, Maya scribes were still producing these books. Bishop Diego de Landa, a Franciscan friar who would later order the burning of virtually every Maya codex he could find, watched a Maya scribe at work and wrote an account of the writing system that, centuries later, would prove crucial to its decipherment. The irony is almost too painful to contemplate. The Maya mathematical system was one of the most elegant ever devised. It was a positional vigesimal system, based on 20 rather than 10, and it included something that most of the world's mathematical traditions had not independently developed: a symbol for zero. The concept of zero as a placeholder in a positional number system was invented in the Maya world by at least the 4th century of the Common Era, roughly contemporaneous with its development in India and well before its adoption in Europe. Without zero, modern mathematics, and by extension modern science, engineering, and computing, is simply impossible. The Maya calendar system was not one calendar, but several interlocking cycles, the most famous of which was the long count, a system capable of tracking time across periods of millions of years. The accuracy of Maya astronomical observations, of the movements of Venus, of solar and lunar eclipses, of the positions of stars, has consistently impressed modern astronomers. The Dresden Codex, one of only 4 surviving pre-Columbian Maya books, contains tables predicting the appearance of Venus as the morning and evening star with an accuracy that differs from modern calculations by only 2 hours and 500 years. The so-called Maya collapse, the abandonment of the great classic period cities of the lowland jungle between roughly 800 and 900 of the Common Era, has captured the Western imagination as a kind of romantic mystery. What brought down this brilliant civilization? The honest answer is that it did not simply collapse. It transformed. The great cities of the southern lowlands were largely abandoned. Yes, for reasons that included prolonged drought, agricultural exhaustion, political fragmentation, and warfare. But the Maya people did not disappear. They moved north into the Yucatan Peninsula. They continued to build cities, Chichen Itza, Uxmal, Mayapan, for centuries after the so-called collapse. By the time Columbus arrived in the Caribbean, more than 500,000 Maya people were living in a post-classic but fully functional civilization in the Yucatan. The Spanish conquistadors who encountered them found not ruins and mystery, but a living, breathing civilization that put up fierce military resistance for nearly 200 years. The Maya story is not a story of collapse. It is a story of resilience and transformation. It is a story that continues to this day, told by the more than 6 million Maya people living in Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, and El Salvador, for whom the civilization of their ancestors is not a mystery, but a heritage. And now we arrive at the city that, above all others, embodies the full, almost unbelievable ambition of the pre-Columbian Americas. It was founded, according to Aztec tradition, in the year 1325 of the Common Era. The founding story goes like this. The Aztec people, then a wandering, marginal group who called themselves the Mexica, had been told by their patron deity, Huitzilopochtli, that they would know the place to build their great city when they saw an eagle perched on a cactus, devouring a serpent. They found that sign, or they claimed to have found it, on a small island in the middle of a lake in the Valley of Mexico. And on that island they began to build. Within a century and a half, what had begun as a small island settlement had become one of the most spectacular cities on the face of the earth. The city was called Tenochtitlan. By 1492, the year Columbus crossed the Atlantic, Tenochtitlan had a population of somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 people. Some estimates go higher. At the time, the city of London had a population of roughly 50,000. Paris had perhaps 200,000 at most. Seville, the greatest port city in Spain, the city from which Columbus himself would set sail, had a population of around 60,000. Tenochtitlan was, by any reasonable estimate, one of the 5 largest cities on the entire planet in the year 1492. And it was unlike any city in the world. The island on which it was built had been expanded over generations by an extraordinary feat of hydraulic engineering. The Aztecs had mastered the construction of chinampas, floating gardens built from layers of aquatic vegetation, lake mud, and organic matter, anchored to the lake bed and woven together with the roots of willow trees. Through the construction of thousands of these artificial islands, the Aztecs had not only massively increased the agricultural productivity of the lake basin, but had literally created new land, expanding the footprint of the island city far beyond its natural size. The Chinampas of the Valley of Mexico could produce up to 7 harvests per year in favorable conditions, making Tenochtitlan's agricultural hinterland among the most productive on Earth. The city itself was connected to the mainland by 3 great causeways, wide, engineered road bridges that allowed foot traffic, trade goods, and military movement in and out of the island in enormous volumes. These causeways were fitted with removable wooden drawbridges that could be raised to control access, making Tenochtitlan, in a military sense, nearly impregnable from land. The city's fresh water supply was brought in from springs on the mainland through 2 massive aqueducts, engineering marvels that maintained separate channels for flowing clean water and for maintenance, allowing the system to stay in constant operation. At a time when most European cities drew their drinking water from the same rivers they used for sewage, Tenochtitlan had a reliable, engineered fresh water delivery system serving hundreds of thousands of people. The city's streets and canals formed an intricate grid. Travel within the city was possible either on foot along the paved causeways and walkways, or by canoe along the network of canals that wove between the built-up areas like liquid streets. Bernal Diaz del Castillo, a Spanish soldier who marched into Tenochtitlan with Hernán Cortés in 1519, left a written account of what he saw that reads like something between a military report and a fever dream. He wrote that when he and his fellow soldiers beheld the city, they could not believe their eyes. They said to each other that it was like the enchanted things described in the Book of Amadis, because of the great towers and temples and buildings rising from the water, and all built of stonework. Some of the soldiers asked whether the things they saw were not a dream. These were hardened conquistadors, men who had sailed across an ocean, survived the Caribbean, marched through dense jungle, and fought numerous battles. And the sight of Tenochtitlan stopped them cold. What were they seeing? They were seeing, among other things, the great market of Tlatelolco. Tlatelolco was Tenochtitlan's twin city on the northern part of the island, and its market was among the most extraordinary commercial institutions in the world. Hernán Cortés himself, writing to the Spanish king Charles I, described the Tlatelolco market in terms of barely contained astonishment. He wrote that he had been in great cities such as Rome and Constantinople, and he had never seen a marketplace so large, so orderly, and so filled with every kind of merchandise. He estimated that 60,000 people bought and sold there every day. Other accounts suggest the market on major market days, held every 5 days, drew as many as 100,000 people. The market was organized, not the chaotic tumult of a bazaar, but a deliberately ordered commercial institution with separate sections for different categories of goods. There were sections for food, for cloth, for pottery, for jewelry, for slaves, for medicinal plants, for timber, for live animals, for gold and silver and precious stones. There were inspectors who moved through the market, checking the quality of goods and the accuracy of measures. There was a dedicated court, a tribunal of judges, that sat in session in the market itself to resolve commercial disputes on the spot. This was not primitive exchange. This was regulated commerce, operating within a legal and institutional framework. The city also housed a zoo, a royal botanical garden, a great temple complex at its center, the Templo Mayor, where religious ceremonies, including human sacrifice, were conducted with elaborate ritual precision. The Aztec state was not gentle. Its imperial expansion was driven by conquest, and its religion demanded blood. These things are true, and they do not need to be softened. But they also do not diminish the achievement of the city itself, any more than the brutalities of Rome diminish the achievement of Roman civilization. Great civilizations have always had their shadows. Tenochtitlan had a shadow as dark as any, and a light as bright as few. When the Spanish finally destroyed Tenochtitlan in 1521, After a brutal siege of 75 days that killed tens of thousands of the city's inhabitants and reduced its extraordinary buildings to rubble, the soldiers who walked through the ruins reportedly wept. Not with triumph, with something closer to grief. They had destroyed something they knew, even in the act of destroying it, they would never fully understand. Mexico City was built on top of it, directly on top of it. The stones of the Templo Mayor were used to build the first cathedral. The canals were filled in and paved over. The lake itself was drained over the following centuries, leaving the city that is now home to more than 20 million people sitting on an unstable, subsiding lakebed that was, not so long ago, the floor of a world. For cities, Cahokia in Illinois, Teotihuacan in Mexico, the Maya cities of the lowland jungle, Tenochtitlan on its island in a mountain lake. For cities from 4 different corners of a world that was anything but empty, anything but primitive, anything but waiting to be discovered. And here is what you need to hold on to as we move forward. These were not exceptional. These were not the lucky accidents of a few exceptional places. These were the peaks of an enormous, complex, continent-wide pattern of urban development, agricultural sophistication, and cultural achievement that had been building for thousands of years. The Americas, in the centuries before Columbus, were a world of cities. A world of peoples who had looked at a river floodplain, an island in a lake, a jungle clearing, a mountain valley, and decided that this was a place worth building something magnificent. And then they built it, with their hands, with their minds, with the accumulated knowledge of 100 generations. The cities were the most visible expression of this world. But they were not the whole of it, because cities do not sustain themselves in isolation. They are fed, they are supplied, they are connected. And to understand how the cities of the pre-Columbian Americas fed and connected themselves, we have to follow the roads. We have to follow the rivers. We have to follow the traders and the diplomats and the pilgrims as they moved across this vast, living, breathing continent. We have to follow the trade. The copper pendant found in a burial mound in Ohio did not come from Ohio. It came from the Great Lakes, more than 500 miles away. The marine shells found buried with the dead in the mountains of Tennessee came from the Gulf of Mexico. The obsidian blade found in a ceremonial cache in the Mississippi Valley was made from volcanic glass that was quarried in what is now Wyoming. None of these things moved by accident. None of them moved by magic. They moved because people carried them. People who knew where they were going, who knew who they would trade with when they got there, who understood that the world beyond the horizon was not a mystery, but a market. The trade networks of the pre-Columbian Americas were among the most extensive and sophisticated on Earth. And the story of how they worked begins with a river. There is a burial mound in a field in southern Ohio that has been quietly rewriting the history of North America for more than a century. It was excavated in the 1800s by archaeologists working in the Scioto River Valley, and what they pulled from the earth inside it should not, by any logic of the world they thought they understood, have been there. There were sheets of hammered copper, worked into ornamental shapes with a skill and delicacy that spoke of long practice and deep tradition. There were thousands of freshwater pearls, strung and arranged in ways that suggested they had adorned the body of someone of tremendous importance. There were obsidian blades, dark and mirror-sharp, made from volcanic glass of a kind that does not exist anywhere in Ohio. There were sheets of mica, thin as paper and bright as a mirror, cut into the shapes of human hands and bear claws and serpents. There were ear spools of hammered silver. There are the teeth of grizzly bears, the bones of birds from the Atlantic coast, and the shells of marine mollusks from the warm waters of the Gulf of Mexico. The person buried in that mound had never, in all probability, left Ohio. They did not need to. The world came to them. What the archaeologists had stumbled into was not simply the grave of a wealthy individual. It was a window into one of the most extraordinary and least understood commercial systems in the ancient world. A system that moved goods, ideas, and influence across thousands of miles of North American landscape with a regularity and sophistication that challenges everything most Americans were ever taught about the continent's pre-Columbian peoples. It had a name. Archaeologists call it the Hopewell interaction sphere, and it was in its time the nervous system of a continent. The Hopewell tradition, named for a 19th century Ohio landowner on whose farm some of its most spectacular sites were excavated, flourished across a broad swath of eastern North America from roughly 100 years before the Common Era to about 500 years after it. At its geographic heart were the river valleys of southern Ohio, where the Scioto, the Miami, and the Muskingum rivers drained southward toward the Ohio River. But its reach extended far beyond Ohio in every direction. To understand what the Hopewell interaction sphere was, it helps to understand what it was not. It was not an empire. There was no Hopewell emperor, no Hopewell capital, no Hopewell army enforcing trade agreements at the point of a spear. It was not a formal political union of any kind. It was something more subtle and in some ways more impressive. It was a shared ceremonial and commercial framework, a set of overlapping relationships and mutual understandings between dozens of distinct peoples across an enormous geographic area, all participating in a common system of exchange that bound them together in ways that were powerful precisely because they were voluntary. The mechanism of exchange was ceremony. Specifically, it was the elaborate burial ritual that Hopewell peoples practiced for their most important dead. The construction of a great burial mound and the deposition within it of extraordinary objects from distant places was both an act of religious devotion and an act of political statement. It announced to anyone who saw it and to the community that participated in it that the people of this place were connected, that their leaders were important enough to command goods from the far corners of the world, that they were part of something larger than themselves. And to participate in that system, you needed to trade. You needed to send your own local specialties outward and receive in return the exotic materials that gave the ceremony its power and meaning. Copper came from the shores of Lake Superior, where it occurred in rare deposits of nearly pure native metal that could be hammered directly into shape without smelting. Obsidian came from the Yellowstone Plateau in what is now Wyoming, a distance of nearly 2,000 miles from the Ohio heartland. Mica came from the mountains of North Carolina. Shark teeth and alligator skulls came from the Gulf Coast of Florida. Grizzly bear canines came from the Rocky Mountains. Pipestone, a smooth, soft, carvable stone of a deep red color, came from quarries in present-day Minnesota that were considered sacred ground, where peoples of different nations could come to quarry in peace. These were not luxury goods moving casually between neighbors. They were moving across thousands of miles through a chain of relationships, hand to hand, community to community, across rivers and mountain ranges and prairies and forests, in a system that required trust, reciprocity, and a shared understanding of value that transcended any single culture or language group. The copper work of the Hopewell peoples was among the finest metalwork produced anywhere in the world in its time. Craftspeople hammered sheets of Lake Superior copper into headdress ornaments, ear spools, breastplates, and ceremonial tools with a precision and artistry that required years of training and a deep understanding of the material. The mica cutouts found in Ohio burial mounds, those delicate, shimmering silhouettes of hands and claws and serpents, required mica sheets that had been transported from the Appalachian Mountains and then worked by artisans whose skill was so refined that they could cut through a material as thin and fragile as a fingernail without shattering it. Think about what that means. Somewhere in the mountains of North Carolina, a person dug mica from the earth and began the process of moving it northward and westward. Somewhere along the way, it passed through the hands of intermediaries, people who traded it onward for something else of value. Eventually, it arrived in Ohio, where a craftsperson who had spent years learning the specific art of mica cutting took it up and made from it something beautiful enough to accompany the most important dead. And somewhere at the far end of another chain of exchanges, the obsidian from Yellowstone, the copper from Lake Superior, the shells from the Gulf Coast, all converged in the same place, in the hands of the same craftspeople, deposited in the same mounds. This is not primitive exchange. This is not casual barter between neighboring villages. This is a continental commercial system operating on a scale and with a sophistication that most Americans would not believe possible in North America before the arrival of Europeans. The Hopewell tradition faded after roughly 500 of the Common Era for reasons that archaeologists continue to debate. But the rivers and the relationships it used did not disappear. They simply changed hands. The great river highways of North America, the Ohio, the Illinois, the Missouri, the Tennessee, the Cumberland, and above all the Mississippi, continued to carry trade and people and ideas for another 1,000 years, feeding the Mississippian cities we explored in Act 2 and sustaining a web of commercial and cultural connection that by 1492 had been operating in some form for nearly 2,000 years. Now turn west. Travel across the Great Plains and into the high desert of the American Southwest. Enter a landscape that looks, to the modern eye, harsh and inhospitable. Red rock canyons, scrub desert, relentless sun. A place where survival seems to demand all available human energy, leaving nothing for complexity or ambition. That impression is wrong. In the San Juan Basin of what is now northwestern New Mexico, in a remote canyon accessible today only by a rough, unpaved road, the ruins of a civilization announce themselves in a way that stops every first-time visitor with the same involuntary catch of breath. These are the great houses of Chaco Canyon, and they're among the most remarkable architectural achievements in North American history. The largest of them is called Pueblo Bonito. It stands partially restored and partially still buried at the base of the canyon's north wall. At its height, between roughly 850 and 1150 of the Common Era, Pueblo Bonito was a D-shaped structure of more than 600 rooms arranged across multiple stories, rising in places to 5 stories in height. Its walls were built of carefully shaped sandstone laid in distinctive patterns that archaeologists can use to date different phases of construction. Its rooms were organized around 2 great kivas, circular, semi-subterranean ceremonial chambers that served as the spiritual and social heart of the community. Chaco Canyon was home to at least a dozen of these great houses, and the complex as a whole represents an investment of architectural and organizational effort that dwarfs anything else in the pre-Columbian Southwest. Moving the timber necessary to roof the great houses alone required transporting more than 200,000 wooden beams, many of them ponderosa pine logs more than 15 feet long, from mountain forests more than 50 miles away. There were no draft animals. There were no wheeled vehicles. Every log was carried on human shoulders. But the great houses of Chaco Canyon are only the most visible part of what Chaco was. What Chaco really was, at its peak in the 11th and early 12th centuries, was the center of a regional system of extraordinary reach and sophistication. The Chacoan road system is one of the most enigmatic and fascinating archaeological features in North America. Radiating outward from the central canyon in multiple directions, these roads were engineered to a standard that speaks of a highly organized society with a clear concept of infrastructure. They were straight, not approximately straight, geometrically straight, running in precise lines for distances of up to 60 miles, regardless of the terrain in their path. Where a hill stood in the way, the road went over it rather than around it, sometimes incorporating carved stone stairways to maintain the straight line. The roads were bordered by low earthen berms and measured consistently between 12 and 30 feet in width. Why straight? No one knows with certainty. In a society without wheeled vehicles or draft animals, the efficiency advantage of a straight road over a winding one is limited. Some archaeologists have argued that the straightness was ritual rather than practical, that these were roads designed for procession and ceremony rather than commerce. Others point out that straight lines are the most efficient for human runners, and that the roads may have been the infrastructure of a relay communication system. Most likely, they served both purposes simultaneously. The road was the message and the medium. More than 400 miles of these roads have been documented, connecting Chaco Canyon to more than 150 outlying communities spread across the San Juan Basin and beyond. These outliers were not simply villages that happened to share a similar architectural style. They were nodes in a deliberate network, each one built to Chacoan architectural standards, each one oriented in relation to the canyon, each one connected by road to the larger system. What was moving along these roads? The excavations at Chaco Canyon have produced some extraordinary answers. Tens of thousands of pieces of turquoise have been found at Chacoan sites, making this the largest concentration of worked turquoise in the prehistoric Southwest. Some of the turquoise was mined locally, but much of it came from distant sources, including the Cerrillos Hills near present-day Santa Fe, some 180 miles to the southeast. Chaco was not just consuming turquoise. It was processing and redistributing it. Workshops at Chaco produced finished turquoise, jewelry, and ornaments on a scale suggesting significant export production. And then there are the macaws. In the ruins of Pueblo Bonito and other Chacoan great houses, archaeologists have found the skeletal remains of scarlet macaws. These brilliantly colored parrots are native to tropical forests in Mexico and Central America, hundreds of miles to the south. They were kept alive, maintained, and cared for. And when they died, they were buried with a care that suggests they were objects of both significant material value and spiritual importance. Their brilliant red feathers were almost certainly used in ceremonial regalia. The macaws at Chaco were not wild-caught birds that happened to wander north. They were bred and traded through a supply chain that connected the American Southwest to Mesoamerica. The most compelling evidence for this comes from a site called Pacoima, in what is now the Mexican state of Chihuahua, which flourished between roughly 900 and 1500 of the Common Era. Pacoima was, among other things, a macaw breeding facility. More than 300 macaw skeletal remains have been found there, along with the remains of pens and cages clearly designed for keeping large numbers of birds. From Pacoima, macaws moved northward along a trade corridor into the American Southwest, appearing at Chaco Canyon, a Mesa Verde, and at dozens of other ancestral Puebloan sites across the region. This was not local exchange. This was a supply chain spanning more than 1,000 miles, connecting two of the most sophisticated cultural regions in North America, moving luxury goods in both directions across the high desert. Turquoise went south from Chaco to Mesoamerican markets, where it was as valuable as jade. Macaws, copper bells, and the iconography of the feathered serpent deity moved north. Ideas moved in both directions. The Chacoan road system, the great houses, even aspects of Chacoan ceremonial life, show the influence of Mesoamerican practices filtered through the long-distance corridor of exchange. The Southwest and Mesoamerica were not separate worlds. They were connected worlds, linked by traders who knew the routes and the relationships that made the journey possible. Now travel further south, deep into the heart of Mesoamerica, into the bustling commercial world of the Aztec Empire, and meet a group of people whose profession was as dangerous as it was prestigious. They were called the Pactica, and they were among the most remarkable figures in the entire pre-Columbian Americas. The Pactica were the professional long-distance merchants of Aztec society. They were not casual traders or part-time market vendors. They were a hereditary occupational class, organized into their own guilds, living in their own districts of the great cities, worshiping their own patron deity, subject to their own legal codes, and enjoying a social status that placed them in a complex and sometimes uneasy position just below the warrior and priestly aristocracies. Their work was genuinely dangerous. Pactica trading expeditions traveled deep into territories far beyond the boundaries of Aztec political control, into regions where the local rulers might view the arrival of an Aztec merchant caravan as a provocation or an opportunity for profit through violence. The Pactica traveled in large, well-organized groups, often disguised to conceal their Aztec identity, moving quickly and quietly through hostile territory, sleeping in walled compounds when possible, relying on a network of contacts and safe houses maintained through years of relationship building. Were they trading? The goods moving through the Aztec long-distance trade system were among the most valuable in the Mesoamerican world. Quetzal feathers, the iridescent green tail plumes of the resplendent quetzal bird, native to the cloud forests of Guatemala and southern Mexico, were, in the Aztec value system, more precious than gold. They were used in the elaborate feathered headdresses and ceremonial garments of Aztec emperors and high priests, and a single headdress might require the feathers of hundreds of birds. Jade, the sacred green stone of Mesoamerica, moved through trading networks that reached from the jade sources of Guatemala to markets throughout Mexico and Central America. Cacao, the seed of the chocolate tree, native to tropical lowland forests, was so valuable in the Aztec world that it served as a form of currency. You could, in a Mesoamerican market, buy a tamale for 1 cacao bean, a rabbit for 30 beans, and the services of a skilled craftsperson for considerably more. Obsidian moved in enormous quantities through Mesoamerican trade networks, as it had for thousands of years before the Aztecs. The primary source in central Mexico was the volcanic deposits at Pachuca and Otumba, both within the Aztec imperial heartland, giving the empire a strategic resource advantage. Obsidian blades were the cutting tools of everyday life across Mesoamerica, used in kitchens, in workshops, in surgical procedures, and in the ritual bloodletting that was central to Mesoamerican religious practice. Cotton cloth, rubber balls used in the sacred ball game, exotic animal skins, dried chilies, salt, and copper bells all moved through the same networks. And at the center of this commercial web stood the great market of Tlatelolco, which we glimpsed in Act 2. But it deserves a closer look here in the context of trade because it was not simply a large market. It was a market system of extraordinary institutional sophistication. The Tlatelolco market had standardized units of measure. The quantities in which goods were sold were regulated, and inspectors moved through the market with the authority to confiscate short-weighted goods and sanction dishonest traders. The market had a dedicated legal tribunal, a court of merchant judges who sat in permanent session during market hours and heard commercial disputes, delivering judgments on the spot. There was a lost and found system. There were porters and carriers available for hire to move purchased goods. There were money changers handling transactions between different commodity currencies. This was, by every meaningful definition, a sophisticated commercial institution operating under the rule of law. Hernán Cortés, a man not known for generosity toward the people he was in the process of conquering, wrote to his king that the organization and the governance of the Tlatelolco market exceeded anything he had seen in Europe. He was not exaggerating for effect. He was reporting what he saw. The Aztec commercial system was embedded within a broader Mesoamerican trading world that had been operating in various forms for more than 2,000 years before the Aztecs rose to power. The trade routes that the Pactica traveled were not routes they had invented. They were routes they had inherited, refined, and expanded. Routes that connected the Aztec heartland to the Maya cities of the Yucatan, to the Zapotec and Mixtec cities of Oaxaca, to the Gulf Coast civilizations, to the Pacific Coast traders, and through the Turquoise Corridor to the ancestral Puebloan world of the American Southwest. Mesoamerica was not a collection of isolated civilizations meeting each other occasionally across great distances. It was a commercial and cultural ecosystem of extraordinary density and complexity, in which goods, ideas, artistic styles, religious concepts, and agricultural knowledge circulated continuously and in all directions. Now travel south again, past the narrow waste of Central America, past the rainforests of Colombia and Ecuador, up into the high, cold, breathtaking world of the Andes Mountains. And prepare yourself for what may be the single most extraordinary infrastructure achievement in the pre-Columbian Americas. By the time the Inca Empire reached its maximum extent in the early 1500s of the Common Era, it was the largest empire in the Western Hemisphere and one of the largest in the world. It stretched more than 2,400 miles along the western coast of South America, from what is now southern Colombia in the north to central Chile in the south, encompassing the high Andean Plateau, the Pacific coastal desert, and portions of the tropical lowland east of the mountains. Its population, by conservative modern estimates, was somewhere between 9 million and 12 million people. Other estimates go considerably higher. Binding this vast empire together, moving its armies and its administrators and its goods and its information across terrain that includes some of the most formidable geography on Earth, was a road system of astonishing scale and engineering sophistication. The Inca called it the Capac Nan, the Royal Road, the spine of the world. It was not one road. It was a network. Modern surveys have identified more than 23,000 miles of engineered roads across the Andean and coastal regions, a figure that exceeds the total length of the Roman road network at the height of the Roman Empire. Let that comparison rest for a moment. The Inca road system was longer than the Roman road system, built without iron tools, without the wheel, without draft animals capable of the heavy haulage that Roman road building relied on, built by human labor, organized and directed by a state system of labor taxation called MITA, in which communities across the empire contributed periodic labor service to the state in lieu of monetary taxation. The roads were engineered to a standard appropriate to their terrain. In the coastal desert, they were flat, straight, and wide, sometimes flanked by adobe walls that provided shade and marked the route through the featureless landscape. In the mountains, they were narrower, paved with flat stones fitted carefully against the slope, and equipped with stone staircases where the gradient demanded it. In the high, treeless grassland of the Puna, they were marked by stone cairns that guided travelers through landscape without natural landmarks. Across the gorges and river valleys that cut through the Andes, the Inca built suspension bridges, hanging structures of braided fiber cables, some of them spanning more than 100 feet across roaring mountain rivers, that were strong enough to carry the heavily loaded llama caravans that were the primary means of bulk transport. The bridges were maintained by the communities living near them, under the MITA system, and were rebuilt periodically as the fiber cables aged and weakened. The most famous of them, the Quechua Bridge over the Apurimac River, has been maintained and rebuilt continuously by the local community using traditional techniques for more than 500 years. It still stands today, a living thread connecting the present to the Inca world. Along the roads, at regular intervals of roughly a day's walking distance, the Inca maintained a network of tambos, state rest houses and storehouses that provided food, shelter, and supplies for official travelers, military units, and the state labor corps. There were thousands of these rest stops across the road network, each one stocked from the enormous state storehouse system that was one of the most remarkable features of Inca governance. In the valleys and on the hillsides across the empire, the Inca maintained vast complexes of round stone storehouses called calcas, positioned at high elevations where the cold, dry air served as a natural refrigerant. These storehouses held, in carefully organized quantities, freeze-dried potatoes, dried meat, dried fish, dried corn, textiles, weapons, sandals, and every other category of goods that the state might need to move troops, feed disaster-struck communities, or reward loyal service. The state storehouse system was, among other things, a food security network. In years of drought or crop failure, the state could draw on its reserves to feed affected communities. In years of abundance, communities contributed surplus production to the storehouses as their labor tax obligation. It was a redistribution system that provided a degree of protection against the agricultural uncertainty of Andean ecology that no individual family or community could achieve on its own. Moving through this infrastructure system at extraordinary speed was the communication network that gave the Inca Empire its most remarkable operational capability. They were called the Chasquis. They were relay runners, young men selected for their speed and endurance, stationed at relay posts along the roads at intervals of roughly 1.5 miles. A message, or a small physical object, could be passed from runner to runner along the relay chain at a speed that modern estimates put it somewhere between 150 and 250 miles per day. A message sent from Cusco, the Inca capital high in the Peruvian Andes, could reach Quito, more than 1,000 miles to the north, in roughly 5 to 7 days. The Chasquis carried more than messages. They carried fresh fish from the Pacific coast to the emperor's table in Cusco, 2 weeks' march from the sea. They carried administrative records encoded in quipus, the knotted string devices that served as the Inca's primary information storage and retrieval system, back and forth between the capital and the provincial administrative centers. They were the nerves of an empire, carrying sensation and command between its brain and its extremities at a speed that made governance across such a vast and difficult terrain actually possible. The trade that moved along the Inca roads was not free market trade in a Mesoamerican sense. The Inca state was a command economy of a thoroughness unmatched anywhere else in the pre-Columbian Americas. The state organized production, controlled distribution, and managed the exchange of goods across the empire's altitude zones in a system of redistribution rather than market exchange. Coastal communities produced dried fish, cotton, and maritime goods. Highland communities produced potatoes, quinoa, freeze-dried foods, and llama wool. Lowland tropical communities produced coca leaves, feathers, and forest products. All of this moved through the state redistribution system, flowing inward to the storehouses and outward to communities and workers across the empire. But the Inca did not invent long-distance Andean exchange. They inherited it, as the Aztecs had inherited their trade networks, from a tradition of commerce and connection that went back thousands of years. The Tiwanaku civilization, centered on the high plateau of present-day Bolivia at more than 12,000 feet above sea level, had been operating long-distance exchange networks across the Andes and down to the Pacific coast for more than 500 years before the Inca appeared. The Wari Empire, which preceded the Inca across much of the Peruvian highlands, had built road infrastructure and administered provincial territories in ways that the Inca consciously adopted and expanded. The Chimu state on the northern coast of Peru had operated a sophisticated long-distance maritime trade network that ran its balsa with sailing vessels along the Pacific coast, exchanging Andean copper and wool for tropical goods from Ecuador and Colombia. Long-distance trade was not something the peoples of the Americas stumbled into. It was something they built, refined, and expanded across thousands of years of accumulated knowledge and relationship. By the time Columbus was preparing his fleet in Seville in 1492, the commercial systems of the Americas were older, in some cases, than the civilization of ancient Rome. They had outlasted empires. They had survived droughts and famines and political collapses. They had adapted and transformed and continued. They were, in a word, permanent. Set these images side by side for a moment. A Hopewell trader carrying a bundle of Lake Superior copper down the Ohio River toward the ceremonial centers of southern Ohio. A Chicoan road crew maintaining the engineered surface of a perfectly straight desert road running northward from the canyon toward a distant outlier community. A Poctica merchant moving quietly and quickly through the jungle of the Gulf Coast lowlands, carrying a cargo of quetzal feathers bound for the market at Tlatelolco. A Chaska runner sprinting uphill along a stone-paved Andean road, a quipu in his hand and a message in his memory, pushing toward the next relay post as fast as his legs will carry him. These are not images from a primitive world. They are not images from a world waiting to be connected to history by the arrival of a European ship. They are images from a world that had been connecting itself, trading with itself, supplying and sustaining its great cities and its complex societies for 1,000 years before Columbus was born. The Americas were not a wilderness crossed only by the tracks of animals and wandering peoples with no fixed purpose. They were a world threaded through with the arteries of commerce. A world in which the distance between one end of a continent and the other was not an impassable barrier, but a journey. A journey that people made regularly, purposefully, carrying the goods and the ideas and the relationships that knit civilization together. And all of this trade, all of this movement, all of this commercial sophistication was possible only because of something even more fundamental. Something that the peoples of the pre-Columbian Americas had done to the very land they lived on. Something that modern science is only now beginning to fully understand. They had not simply inhabited the Americas. They had engineered them. They had reshaped the forests, the rivers, the soils, the mountains, and the fields of a hemisphere to serve the needs of complex, populous, interconnected civilization. They had, in the deepest and most literal sense, made the Americas. And that story, the story of how human hands and human minds transformed a continent, is the story we tell next. For 2 centuries, the Amazon rainforest was understood by Western science as one of the last great wildernesses on Earth. A natural world, a place where human beings had always lived lightly, leaving almost no trace. The jungle, in this telling, was too dense, too wet, too unforgiving to support anything beyond small, scattered, nomadic bands of forest people who hunted and gathered and moved on without fundamentally altering the landscape around them. It was a beautiful idea. It was also, we now know, entirely wrong. The Amazon is not a wilderness. It never was. It was a garden. One of the largest, most complex, most deliberately created gardens in the history of the world. And the people who built it built much more than a garden. They built an empire of the earth itself. The story of how they did it, and what else the peoples of the pre-Columbian Americas built when they turned their extraordinary minds to the problem of mastering a continent, begins in the soil. Dig your hand into the soil of the central Amazon basin in the right place, and something unexpected happens. The soil of the Amazon rainforest is almost everywhere a deep, rust-colored red. It is old soil, ancient soil, soil that has been leached by millions of years of tropical rainfall until almost all of its nutrients have been washed away into the rivers and carried out to sea. Agricultural scientists who first studied Amazonian soils in the 20th century concluded that they were among the least productive on Earth. The jungle grew on them, yes, but the jungle was a closed loop, recycling its own nutrients in a thin layer at the surface, dependent on the constant fall of dead leaves and decaying matter to maintain its own fertility. Remove the jungle and the soil beneath it was, for practical agricultural purposes, nearly useless. This was why scientists argued the Amazon had never supported large populations. The land simply cannot feed them. And then in certain patches scattered across the basin, you hit a layer of something completely different. It is dark, almost black, soft and rich and faintly sweet-smelling in the way of deep, healthy soil. It is shot through with fragments of charcoal, broken pottery, and animal bone. Where the surrounding forest soil is thin and exhausted, this black earth is deep, sometimes running 3 feet, 5 feet, even 6 feet down into the ground before giving way to the red clay beneath. And it is extraordinarily fertile. Farmers who work it today, without adding any amendments whatsoever, consistently produce yields that dwarf anything achievable on the surrounding natural soil. The local people have a name for it. They call it terra preta, dark earth, and it is not natural. Terra preta was created, deliberately, systematically, over generations, by the people who lived in the Amazon basin before the arrival of Europeans. It was created through a combination of practices that modern soil scientists are still working to fully understand. The incorporation of charcoal produced from slow-burning organic material, the mixing in of organic waste including food scraps, bones, and human excrement, the cultivation of specific microbial communities within the soil, and the patient, repeated working of the earth over decades and centuries until it had been transformed from sterile red clay into one of the most productive agricultural soils ever created. This was not an accident. This was not the unintended consequence of people living in one place for a long time and throwing their garbage on the ground. The evidence from the archaeological record is clear. Terra preta was produced with intent and with method. The people who created it understood, in practical terms, that certain practices transformed the soil in ways that made it more productive, and they pursued those practices deliberately, passing the knowledge from generation to generation, expanding the patches of dark earth across the landscape over hundreds, and in some cases thousands of years. What does it mean that this soil exists? It means that the Amazon was not a wilderness. It means that the people who lived there were not wandering hunter-gatherers, scraping a marginal existence from an unforgiving jungle. It means that the Amazon was, in significant portions of its vast extent, a managed, cultivated, engineered landscape, a landscape that human intelligence and human labor had transformed over millennia into something more productive, more habitable, and more deeply human than anything that nature alone had placed there. And the dark earth is only the beginning. In the western Amazon, in the Brazilian state of Acre near the border with Bolivia, there are things in the forest that you cannot see from the ground. You can only see them from the air. They appeared first to the eyes of researchers in the late 1980s and early 1990s, when forest clearing for cattle, ranching stripped the jungle canopy from large areas of the Acre River Valley and exposed what lay beneath. Pressed into the surface of the ancient soil, like patterns stamped into clay before it hardened, were enormous geometric shapes. Squares, circles, octagons, hexagons, combinations and arrangements of shapes, connected by straight avenues and entrance causeways, spread across the landscape with a regularity and a precision that left no doubt about their origin. They were not natural. They cannot be natural. Nature does not make perfect squares with sides of 800 feet, or perfect circles with precisely measured diameters, or arrangements of geometric forms laid out in consistent orientations across hundreds of square miles of forest floor. These shapes have been made by people who understood geometry well enough to execute it at monumental scale, who had the labor and the organizational capacity to move enormous quantities of earth in precise shapes, and who had reasons, ceremonial, astronomical, territorial, or some combination, for doing so on a scale that is only fully legible from several hundred feet in the air. More than 500 of these geoglyphs have now been identified in Acre State alone, covering an area larger than the state of Great Britain. They were built over a period spanning roughly 1,500 to 2,000 years, beginning perhaps 2,000 years before the Common Era and continuing until shortly before the arrival of Europeans. Archaeologists working in the region have found relatively little evidence of dense permanent settlement within the geoglyphs themselves, suggesting that they served primarily ceremonial or gathering functions, places to which people came for specific purposes, rather than places where people lived permanently. And yet the existence of these structures, built at this scale and with this precision, implies a population capable of organizing and executing monumental labor projects. It implies communities large enough to dedicate significant numbers of people to construction work that produced no immediate agricultural or economic return. It implies social structures sophisticated enough to coordinate that labor and intellectual traditions sophisticated enough to conceive and execute precise geometric construction across landscapes measured in miles. The Amazon that produced the geoglyphs of Acre was not a wilderness inhabited by scattered nomads. It was a populated, organized, socially complex world, leaving permanent marks on the earth on a scale that rivals anything built in the ancient world. But perhaps the most dramatic revision to the story of the Amazon came not from the ground or the air, but from the sky. Specifically, from the technology of LiDAR. LiDAR, light detection and ranging, is an aerial survey technology that fires pulses of laser light at the ground from a low-flying aircraft and measures the return time of the reflections to build precise, three-dimensional maps of the terrain beneath. In open country, LiDAR is useful but not revolutionary. In the Amazon, it is transformative, because LiDAR can see through the jungle canopy. It can map the terrain beneath the trees, stripping away the green cover that has hidden the ground from aerial view for centuries, and revealing the shape of the land as it actually is. What LiDAR is revealing beneath the canopy of the Amazon is rewriting the history of the hemisphere. In 2018, a team of researchers published the results of a LiDAR survey covering more than 5,000 square miles of the Bolivian Amazon in the region of Llanos de Mojos. Beneath the forest and the seasonal floodplains, the LiDAR revealed a landscape so thoroughly modified by human hands that the researchers struggled to find language adequate to describe it. There were 15 sites of dense urban settlement, some covering areas of more than 150 acres, connected to each other by a network of straight causeways, some running for more than 10 miles across the savanna. The settlements were ringed by defensive ditches, organized around central plazas, and surrounded by elaborate systems of raised agricultural fields, fish weirs, and water management infrastructure that transformed the seasonally flooded landscape into year-round productive farmland. The largest of the sites, a place the researchers called Landivar, covered an area of more than 640 acres and showed evidence of dense occupation over centuries. It was not a village. It was not even a large town by some definitions. It was a a city that had been sitting hidden under jungle and grass and the assumptions of Western scholarship for 500 years. The scholar Anna Roosevelt, who has spent decades challenging the myth of the thin, marginal Amazon, has argued consistently and with increasing evidential support that the pre-Columbian Amazon basin was home to populations numbered not in the hundreds of thousands, but in the millions, perhaps tens of millions. The figure most often cited in the current scholarly literature is somewhere between 8 million and 50 million people living in the Amazon basin before European contact. Even the lower end of that range is a number that demands a complete revision of everything most people have been told about pre-Columbian South America. The Amazon was not marginal. It was not empty. It was one of the most densely inhabited regions of the pre-Columbian Americas, and its inhabitants had transformed their landscape over thousands of years into a managed, productive, deeply human world. The dark earth beneath your feet, the geoglyphs pressed into the ancient soil, the cities emerging from the LiDAR maps like ghosts resolving into solid form. All of it is evidence of a civilization of the Amazon that was not primitive, not simple, and not gone. It was erased by epidemic disease that swept through it in the decades before European eyes saw the river for the first time, by the slave raids and missionary campaigns that followed, by centuries of scholarship that could not see what the evidence was pointing to because it had already decided what the Amazon was. It was a wilderness. It was always a wilderness, and it turned out to be a garden all along. The story of how the peoples of the pre-Columbian Americas fed their millions is, in its own right, one of the great untold stories of human civilization. We eat their food today, every day, without knowing it. The Americas gave the world maize, what most Americans call corn. They gave the world the potato, in dozens of varieties cultivated across the Andean highlands over thousands of years, now the fourth largest food crop on Earth. They gave the world the tomato, without which Italian cuisine would not exist as we know it, the chili pepper, the sweet pepper, chocolate, vanilla, squash, pumpkins, sunflowers, avocados, peanuts, pecans, blueberries, strawberries, pineapples, papaya, and tobacco for better or worse. The list continues for longer than most people realize. The global food revolution that followed contact between the Americas and the Old World is sometimes called the Columbian Exchange, and its impact on human population, health, and civilization on every continent was transformative. The introduction of the potato to Ireland and Northern Europe supported a dramatic expansion of European populations in the 17th and 18th centuries. The introduction of maize to Africa transformed agricultural productivity across sub-Saharan regions. The sweet potato, carried westward across the Pacific, became a dietary staple across much of Asia within a century of European contact. All of that abundance, all of that world-changing agricultural fertility had been developed, refined, and in many cases perfected by the peoples of the Americas over thousands of years of systematic agricultural experimentation before any European arrived to carry it eastward. But it was not simply a matter of what crops the Americas produced. It was a matter of how they grew them. In the seasonally flooded savannas of the Bolivian Amazon, the same region where LiDAR is revealing lost cities, archaeologists have documented one of the most remarkable agricultural engineering systems in the ancient world. The Llanos de Mojos is a vast lowland plain that floods for much of the year, rendering conventional agriculture impossible. The people who lived there solved this problem not by abandoning the flooded land, but by engineering it. They built raised fields, thousands upon thousands of raised rectangular platforms of earth, lifted above the flood level, surrounded by channels that both drained the field surfaces and served as fish ponds and sources of aquatic plants. The channels also collected and concentrated organic matter, which was periodically scooped up and spread on the field surfaces as fertilizer. The system was, in effect, a permanent agricultural machine, self-renewing, self-fertilizing, and capable of producing harvest year after year on land that, without human modification, was useless for agriculture. Estimates of the total area of raised field agriculture in the Bolivian Amazon alone run to several thousand square miles. Similar raised field systems have been documented in the Orinoco Basin of Venezuela, on the Caribbean coast of Colombia, and across the coastal lowlands of Ecuador. Wherever pre-Columbian peoples encountered the problem of seasonal flooding, they responded not with retreat, but with engineering. In the highlands of the Andes, the engineering challenge was opposite. Not too much water and too little land, but too much vertical land and too little flat terrain. The Andean solution was the Andean, the agricultural terrace. Terracing of mountain slopes for agriculture is not unique to the Americas. It appears in many parts of the world. But the scale, the engineering precision, and the geographic extent of Andean terrace agriculture was, and remains, extraordinary. Across thousands of miles of Andean mountain slopes in Peru, Bolivia, and Ecuador, pre-Columbian peoples carved the steep hillsides into staircase sequences of flat field surfaces, each one retained by a stone wall, each one carefully graded for drainage, and each one supplied, in many cases, by an irrigation system that channeled water from mountain springs and glacial melt through precisely engineered stone canals to the terraced fields above. The Andes did not simply create flat land. They created microclimates. By trapping solar radiation in the stone walls and terrace surfaces, the Andean system modified the temperature of the immediately surrounding air in ways that extended the growing season and protected crops from the sudden frosts that are a constant agricultural hazard in the high Andes. The stone walls radiated stored heat through the cold mountain nights, keeping the air immediately around the crops several degrees warmer than the surrounding open hillside. This was not accidentally discovered. This was understood, tested, refined, and embedded in agricultural knowledge over generations. The builders of the Andean terraces understood, in practical terms that required no mathematical formulas, the thermal properties of stone, the behavior of cold air drainage on mountain slopes, and the specific frost tolerance thresholds of the crops they were growing. They were, in the most meaningful sense of the word, engineers. And then there were the Chinampas of the Valley of Mexico, which we glimpsed in Act 2 in the context of Tenochtitlan, but which deserve attention here in the context of agricultural innovation. The Chinampa system, the construction of raised garden beds in shallow lake margins, separated by water channels, built from alternating layers of lake vegetation and mud and anchored by willow trees, was perhaps the most intensively productive agricultural system ever devised anywhere in the pre-Columbian world. A well-maintained Chinampa could produce harvests of corn, beans, squash, tomatoes, chili peppers, and flowers almost continuously throughout the growing season. The channels between the beds provided irrigation, fish, and aquatic plants. The willow trees provided fuel wood and binding material. The lake mud periodically dredged from the channels and spread on the bed surfaces provided fertilizer. The system was, in agricultural engineering terms, close to a closed loop, nearly self-sustaining, extraordinarily productive, and capable of feeding urban populations of density that would not be matched in the Americas again until the industrial era. And across eastern North America, the people who built Cahokia and the Mississippian cities were practicing a form of agriculture that was, in its own way, a work of ecological genius. It was called the Three Sisters: corn, beans, and squash planted together in the same mound. The corn provided a vertical structure for the bean vines to climb. The beans, as legumes, fixed atmospheric nitrogen in the soil, enriching it for the benefit of the corn and squash. The squash spread its broad leaves across the ground between the mounds, shading out competing weeds and retaining soil moisture in the dry summer heat. Three plants, each one enhancing the growing conditions of the others, producing together a nutritional combination: carbohydrates, proteins, and vitamins, more complete than any one of them alone could provide. The Three Sisters system maintained the fertility of agricultural land in the eastern woodlands for generations without the addition of external fertilizers. It was an agricultural practice as elegant and as carefully thought out as any in the world, developed through centuries of observation, experimentation, and the patient accumulation of ecological knowledge that is one of the deepest expressions of human intelligence. The peoples of the pre-Columbian Americas did not simply grow food. They understood the systems that made food possible, and they engineered those systems with a sophistication that the world is only now beginning to fully appreciate. Now travel to the mountains of southern Peru, high above the sacred valley of the Urubamba River, to the greatest empire the Western Hemisphere had ever seen. The Inca, Tawantinsuyu, the four quarters of the world. We touched on the Inca road system in Act 3, in the context of trade and communication. But the Inca were far more than road builders. They were the architects of an entire world. A world of extraordinary organizational complexity and human achievement that, at its height in the early 1500s, encompassed a population of somewhere between 10 million and 37 million people, more than the population of England, France, and Spain combined at the same moment in history. The Inca Empire was the result of a meteoric rise. As late as 1300 of the Common Era, the Inca were a small, relatively unremarkable highland group centered around the valley of Cusco in the southern Peruvian Andes. Within 150 years, through a combination of military conquest, strategic alliance, and the ruthless administrative genius of a series of remarkable rulers, they had built the largest territorial empire in the Western Hemisphere. In the lifetime of a single human being, roughly between 1438 and 1527, the Inca Empire expanded from a regional polity of perhaps 100,000 people to a continent-spanning superstate, encompassing dozens of distinct ethnic groups, languages, and ecological zones. How did they hold it together? The answer begins at Cusco. The Inca capital was not simply the seat of government. It was the center of the world, literally, in the Inca cosmological understanding. From Cusco, four great roads ran outward in the four cardinal directions, defining the four quarters of the empire that gave Tawantinsuyu its name. The city itself was laid out in the shape of a puma, the sacred feline of the Inca cosmology, with the great fortress of Sacsayhuaman forming the puma's head on the hill above the city. Sacsayhuaman deserves a moment of genuine attention. It is a structure so remarkable that for centuries after the Spanish conquest, European observers refused to believe that indigenous people had built it. They attributed it to giants, to supernatural forces, to pre-flood civilizations, to anything except the straightforward truth, which was that Inca engineers and stonemasons had created one of the most technically demanding feats of construction in the ancient world. The outer walls of Sacsayhuaman are built of enormous limestone and andesite blocks, some of them weighing more than 100 tons. The largest single stone in the structure is estimated to weigh somewhere between 300 and 360 tons, roughly the equivalent of 360 modern automobiles stacked together. These blocks were quarried miles from the construction site, moved across mountainous terrain without wheeled vehicles or metal tools, and fitted together with a precision so extraordinary that the joints between adjacent blocks weighing dozens or hundreds of tons, are so tight that not even a sheet of paper could be slid between them. The Inca did not use mortar. They did not need it. The precision of their stone fitting was so exact that the interlocking surfaces of adjacent blocks held each other in place through gravity and contact alone. And the joints were not flat. They were shaped in subtle, irregular ways that made each block fit its neighbors on multiple contoured surfaces simultaneously, creating a structure that absorbed and distributed seismic energy in ways that have allowed Inca stonework to survive earthquakes that destroyed the Spanish colonial buildings constructed on top of and beside it. Cusco has been shaken by major earthquakes repeatedly since the Spanish conquest. The Inca walls stand. The Spanish walls fall. Machu Picchu, the most famous of all Inca sites, sits at about 8,000 feet above sea level on a narrow mountain ridge above the Urubamba River, accessible from the valley below only by a steep and winding trail. It was built, most likely as a royal estate and ceremonial retreat, sometime in the mid to late 1400s during the reign of the Emperor Pachacuti, the greatest of the Inca rulers and the architect of the empire's dramatic expansion. Its terraces cascade down the mountain slopes in elegant curves. Its temples and royal residences are built to the same standard of precision stone fitting seen at Sacsayhuaman. Its astronomical alignments are precise, The rising sun at the winter solstice enters through a specific window in the principal temple and strikes a specific point on the floor in a demonstration of observational and engineering precision that required both sophisticated astronomical knowledge and the ability to execute construction to tolerances of fractions of an inch. Machu Picchu was abandoned sometime around the Spanish conquest, likely as a consequence of the epidemic disease and civil war that destabilized the empire in the 1520s and 30s and was not encountered by Spanish colonial authorities in any documented way. It sat, largely forgotten by the outside world, until the American explorer Hiram Bingham was guided to it by local farmers in 1911. When photographs of the site appeared in National Geographic magazine the following year, they astonished the world. Here, in the mountains of Peru, was a city of stone so precisely and beautifully constructed that it seemed almost impossible. It seemed, to the Western eye encountering it for the first time, like something out of mythology. It was not mythology. It was engineering. It was the work of human minds and human hands, working within a tradition of accumulated knowledge that had been developing in the Andes for thousands of years before Machu Picchu's first stone was laid. The Inca also administered their empire through a system of record-keeping that has fascinated and perplexed scholars for centuries. The quipu, from the Quechua word for knot, was a device made of a main cord from which hung dozens or hundreds of pendant strings of various colors and materials. Knots tied in specific positions along each string, using specific knot types, encoded numerical information in a decimal positional system. Through quipus, the Inca state recorded census data, tax assessments, tribute payments, military inventories, and agricultural outputs across thousands of miles of territory. The numerical quipu is well understood, but there is growing evidence, developed most compellingly by the anthropologist Gary Urton, that some quipus encoded non-numerical information, narrative content, historical records, perhaps even something approaching a true writing system. If that interpretation is correct, the Inca had developed a form of recording and transmitting complex information that had no equivalent anywhere in the pre-Columbian Americas outside of Mesoamerica. They had, in other words, solved one of the fundamental problems of running a large, complex state, the problem of information storage and retrieval, through a technology entirely unlike anything else in the world's long history of writing. And now we arrive at perhaps the most important and the most persistently misunderstood dimension of pre-Columbian civilization in the Americas: the life of the mind. The myth of the empty wilderness was not only a myth about population and cities and trade routes. It was a myth about intellect, about the capacity of the people of the Americas to observe the world, reason about it, record their observations, and build on the accumulated knowledge of previous generations in the systematic way that we call science. That capacity was as fully present in the Americas as anywhere on Earth, and its achievements were, in several fields, extraordinary by any global standard. Begin with mathematics. The Maya, as we noted in Act 2, independently invented the concept of zero, the abstract placeholder that makes positional arithmetic and therefore all higher mathematics possible. This is not a minor achievement. Zero was independently invented by the full sweep of human history in only a handful of places. In Babylon, in India, in the Maya world. The step from counting to true positional arithmetic, with a symbol for the absence of a quantity, is one of the most conceptually difficult steps in the history of mathematics. The Maya took it on their own, sometime in the first few centuries of the Common Era, and used it to build a mathematical system of great sophistication and practical power. But it was in astronomy that the intellectual achievements of the pre-Columbian Americas were most spectacular and most thoroughly documented. The Maya astronomical tradition, which we know primarily through the Dresden Codex and through the archaeological study of observatory structures at sites like Chichen Itza and Xochicalco, was a systematic, quantitative, cumulative science. Maya astronomers tracked the movements of the sun, the moon, Venus, Mars, and other celestial bodies over hundreds of years, recording their observations in numerical tables that allowed them to predict future positions and events with a precision that modern astronomers have consistently found astonishing. The Venus tables in the Dresden Codex track the synodic cycle of Venus, the time it takes for Venus to return to the same position relative to the Sun as seen from Earth, across a period of 312 years. The accumulated error in the Maya calculation of the Venus cycle, compared to modern measurements, is approximately 2 hours over that entire 312-year period. The Dresden Codex also contains an eclipse prediction table that successfully identifies intervals at which solar and lunar eclipses can occur based on the alignment of the solar and lunar cycles. It was in use, predicting eclipses with accuracy, centuries before Copernicus proposed that the Earth moved around the Sun. The Caracol Observatory at Chichen Itza is a circular tower whose windows and doorways are aligned with the rising and setting points of Venus at its maximum northern and southern extremes, and with other astronomically significant horizon points. It was designed as an instrument, a precision observing platform, whose architecture encoded the astronomical knowledge its builders had accumulated over generations. You do not build a building like that without centuries of systematic observation behind you. The Aztec calendar system, the Xiapowali, or solar calendar of 365 days, interlocked with the Tanaup-Wali, the sacred calendar of 260 days, produced a combined cycle of 52 years that governed the ritual and agricultural life of Mesoamerican civilization across many cultures and many centuries. The solar calendar's accuracy was superior to the Julian calendar that Columbus carried on his voyage, and that remained the standard in Europe until its reform in 1582. The Nazca lines of coastal Peru, those enormous drawings pressed into the surface of the desert plateau south of Lima, visible in their full form only from the air, have attracted more than their share of fantastic theories. The ancient aliens hypothesis, in particular, has done considerable damage to the public understanding of what the lines actually are. They are not landing strips. They are not messages to extraterrestrials. They are the products of a sophisticated culture with a deep knowledge of desert hydrology, astronomical observation, and ceremonial practice, who used the permanent, windless, rainless surface of the Nazca Plateau as a canvas for ritual drawings and astronomical alignments that connected the human world to the cosmic one. The lines were probably walked during ceremonies, processional pathways connecting sacred sites and water sources in a landscape where water was the most precious of all resources. The medicine of the pre-Columbian Americas deserves at least a moment of the attention it rarely receives. Andean surgeons practiced trepanation, the drilling or cutting of holes in the human skull to relieve pressure from injury or disease, with a technical proficiency that has genuinely surprised modern neurosurgeons. Analysis of trepan skulls from Andean archaeological sites shows clear evidence that a significant proportion of patients survived the procedure, with bone regrowth around the edges of the trepanation indicating survival and recovery over months or years. At one Andean site, survival rates for trepanation in the period immediately before European contact appear to approach 90%. In 19th century Europe, before antiseptic technique, survival rates for similar procedures were often below 50%. The pharmacological knowledge embedded in indigenous American medical traditions represented the accumulated result of thousands of years of systematic plant experimentation. More than 250 distinct plant species were used medicinally in Aztec medicine alone, with documented applications ranging from the treatment of skin infections and gastrointestinal disease to the management of pain, fever, and psychiatric symptoms. Quinine, derived from the bark of the cinchona tree known to Andean healers, became the primary treatment for malaria in the Old World after European contact and remained the most effective anti-malarial medicine available until the 20th century. Cocaine, derived from the coca leaf that Andean peoples had used for thousands of years as a stimulant and painkiller, was the first effective local anesthetic in Western surgery. The pain relief that allowed surgeons to operate without causing their patients to die of shock was, quite literally, a gift from the Andes. These are not curiosities. They are not footnotes. They are the products of scientific traditions, traditions of observation, hypothesis, experimentation, and accumulated knowledge that were operating in the Americas for centuries before any European arrived to observe them. Traditions that were in many areas equal to, and in some areas superior to, the scientific knowledge of contemporary Europe. Traditions that were, within decades of European contact, largely destroyed along with the peoples who carried them. In every act of this documentary, we have been building a picture, layer by layer, civilization by civilization, achievement by achievement. The picture has been coming into focus. It is a picture of a world. A complete, complex, fully realized world, spread across 2 continents and dozens of island chains, inhabited by tens of millions of people, organized into cities and empires and trade networks and intellectual traditions of extraordinary depth and richness. A world that had been building itself, improving itself, feeding and connecting and understanding itself for thousands of years. A world in full flower. By the last decade of the 1400s, the civilizations of the Americas had built cities larger than any in Europe. They had engineered roads longer than the Roman road network. They had cultivated crops that would go on to feed half the planet. They had charted the movements of Venus with greater accuracy than any European astronomer of their era. They had built suspension bridges over mountain gorges, floating gardens on mountain lakes, and geometric monuments visible only from the sky. They had invented zero, constructed empires, written histories, and buried their dead with copper from the Great Lakes and shells from the Gulf of Mexico. They had, in short, done everything that human beings do when they're fully, brilliantly, irrepressibly alive. And then, in the autumn of 1492, 3 ships appeared on the horizon of a Caribbean island. What happened next is the subject of our final act. But before we go there, hold this world in your mind for a moment. Not as a collection of archaeological data points, not as a chapter in a textbook, as a living world, as a world of millions of individual human beings waking up in the morning, feeding their children, arguing with their neighbors, falling in love, go to market, watching the stars, planting their fields, building their cities, and telling each other stories about how the world began and what it meant to be alive in it. That world was real. It was extraordinary. And it was, in the autumn of 1492, standing on the edge of the most catastrophic transformation any human civilization has ever endured. We go there now. The year is 1491. One single year before the crossing. 1 year before everything changes. And the Americas, on that particular turning of the earth around the sun, are as alive as they have ever been. The Inca Emperor Huayna Capac is in the north of his empire, extending its boundaries further than any of his predecessors. In the Valley of Mexico, the streets of Tenochtitlan are humming with the daily commerce of a city of 200,000 souls. In the Yucatan, Maya merchants are loading cargo canoes for the long coastal trading run around the peninsula. In the river valleys of the American Southeast, Mississippian chiefs are receiving tribute and dispensing justice in the great towns of their inherited domains. In the Amazon, farmers are tending the dark earth of their raised fields and the fish weirs of their flooded channels. And across the length and breadth of 2 continents and 1,000 islands, 50 million or 60 million or perhaps many more human beings are living their lives with no knowledge whatsoever that a fleet of 3 wooden ships is being provisioned in a harbor in southern Spain. What is coming toward them is not discovery. It is not civilization. It is not the hand of God or the forward march of history. What is coming toward them is the end of the world as they know it. And the story of that ending, and of everything that survived it, and of why all of it still matters desperately today, is the story we tell last. Close your eyes one more time. It is the year 1491, the last full year the Americas will ever know as their own. The sun rises over the Valley of Mexico and finds Tenochtitlan already awake. The canal boats are moving before dawn, loaded with flowers and vegetables from the Chinampa gardens, pulled silently through the dark water toward the great market at Tlatelolco. On the causeways, The first traders and laborers of the day are already moving, their footsteps echoing on the stone surface above the lake. In the temple district of the city's heart, priests are lighting the first fires of the morning ceremony, sending thin threads of smoke up into the pale sky over a city of 200,000 people. A city that does not know, cannot know, that it has less than 30 years left. Travel south from there, along the Inca roads, past the relay runners sprinting through the cold mountain air with their knotted quipus, past the llama caravans moving slowly along the coastal desert highway, past the Calca storehouses packed with freeze-dried potatoes and folded textiles, all the way to Cusco, the navel of the world. The Inca Emperor Huayna Capac is not in Cusco this year. He is in the north of his empire, in what is now Ecuador, managing the final phase of a military campaign that will extend Tontinseu to its greatest territorial extent in history. He is, by every measure available to him, at the height of his power. He rules more people, more territory, more accumulated wealth, and more organized military force than any ruler the Western Hemisphere has ever produced. He has no reason to believe that anything fundamental is about to change. In the Yucatan Peninsula, Maya merchants are loading large ocean-going canoes with trade goods for the long coastal run around the tip of the peninsula and westward along the Gulf Coast. Their navigational knowledge, accumulated over centuries of open water sailing, is as sophisticated as anything in the contemporary Atlantic world. They know these waters. They have been sailing them for generations. In the river valleys of the American Southeast, the chiefs of the great Mississippian towns are receiving tribute and dispensing justice in the thatched council houses above their earthen mounds. The ceremonial cycle is turning as it always has. The agricultural fields are being prepared for the new planting season. The young men are training for the ball game and the warpath. The elders are telling the children the stories of how the world began. In the Amazon, the farmers of the dark earth settlements are tending their raised fields, managing their fish weirs, maintaining the slow processes of soil enrichment that their grandparents and great-grandparents began and that they will pass on to their own grandchildren. They have no way of knowing that the grandchildren who will inherit this earth are going to inherit a world beyond recognition. And in the forests and plains and river valleys of North America, from the Pacific coast to the Atlantic, from the Arctic tundra to the subtropical Gulf, tens of millions of human beings are waking up, going about their lives, and participating in a world of extraordinary complexity and richness that has been building slowly and magnificently for 15,000 years. This is the world on the eve of 1492. This is everything Columbus never found. On the morning of August the 3rd, 1492, 3 ships left the harbor of Palos de la Frontera on the southwestern coast of Spain. The Nina, the Pinta, the Santa Maria. Their commander was a Genoese navigator in the service of the Spanish crown, a man of fierce ambition and flexible geography, who believed he was sailing west to find a shorter route to Asia and the spice markets of the East. He was wrong about where he was going. He was wrong about where he arrived. He was wrong in ways that he went to his grave without fully understanding about almost everything he thought he knew about the world he had sailed into. Columbus was not a stupid man. He was a gifted navigator, a charismatic leader, and in certain practical respects, a remarkable organizer of difficult expeditions. But he was also a man so comprehensively imprisoned by the story he had already decided to tell that the evidence of his own eyes could not shake it loose. He landed in the Caribbean and called the people he met Indians, because he had decided he was in the Indies. He spent 4 voyages and more than a decade sailing the coasts of the Caribbean and Central and South America, collecting gold and enslaving people and reporting to his patrons, and he died in 1506 still insisting, against mounting evidence to the contrary, that he had reached the outskirts of Asia. The world he had actually reached, its size, its antiquity, its population, its civilizational complexity, was simply beyond his conceptual framework to process. He saw it with his eyes. He did not see it with his mind. And yet, in the most brutal of ironies, even as Columbus failed to understand the world he had encountered, the consequences of that encounter were already beginning to unspool. He and his crews brought something to the Caribbean on those first voyages that was far more devastating than any weapon in their arsenal. They brought germs. The epidemic catastrophe that followed European contact with the Americas was, by any measure available to historians and epidemiologists, the greatest demographic disaster in the recorded history of our species. The peoples of the Americas had been separated from the populations of the Old World for a minimum of 15,000 years. During that time, the great pool of infectious diseases that had developed in Eurasia and Africa, the product of thousands of years of dense human settlement, domesticated livestock, and the pathogens that moved between animals and people in crowded agricultural societies, had never touched the Western Hemisphere. The Americas had their own pathogens, their own endemic diseases, their own medical challenges. But they did not have smallpox. They did not have measles. They did not have typhus or influenza or the bubonic plague or the dozen other epidemic killers that Europeans and Africans have been living with, dying from, and slowly developing partial resistance to for centuries and millennia. When those diseases arrived, they moved through indigenous populations with a speed and a lethality that is almost impossible to fully absorb. Smallpox, in particular, was the great advance agent of conquest. It could travel person to person through populations that had never encountered it, killing between 30 and 60% of the people it infected, and it could run ahead of any European expedition through pre-existing indigenous trade networks, sweeping through populations that had never seen a European face. The timeline of what happened is both precise and staggering. Columbus arrived in the Caribbean in 1492. By 1493, the first epidemic of an unidentified disease, possibly swine influenza, was killing the Taino people of Hispaniola in enormous numbers. Smallpox reached Hispaniola by 1518 and the mainland of Mexico by 1520, running ahead of Hernán Cortés's march on Tenochtitlan. The great smallpox pandemic of 1519 to 1524 swept from Mexico through Central America and down into the Andes, reaching Peru before Francisco Pizarro arrived there in 1532. It killed, among others, the Inca Emperor Huayna Capac and most of his designated heirs, triggering the Civil War that fatally weakened the empire on the eve of the Spanish conquest. Disease ran ahead of European settlement into North America in the same way. The epidemic wave that cleared the New England coast before the Pilgrims arrived in 1620 was likely a combination of plague and other Old World diseases, introduced through contact with European fishing vessels working the Grand Banks. The peoples of the interior of North America were being struck by epidemic waves decades, sometimes generations, before they ever saw a European. The emptiness that greeted the first European settlers moving inland was not primordial. It was recent. It was the echo of a catastrophe. How many people died? The honest answer is that we will never know exactly. The populations before contact are difficult to establish with precision, and the deaths happened largely outside the view of any written record. But the scholarly consensus today, based on decades of careful demographic reconstruction, is that the population of the Americas declined by somewhere between 50 and 90% within the first century of sustained European contact. In some regions, the decline was faster and more complete. The Taino people of the Caribbean, who numbered at least several 100,000 and perhaps several million at the time of Columbus, were reduced to a remnant population within 30 years. The densely populated chiefdoms of the southeastern United States, which had supported the great Mississippian cities, were reduced to fragmented, greatly diminished successor communities within a century of first contact with Spanish expeditions. Take the middle of the range. Say 75% dead within 100 years. Apply that to a pre-contact population of 60 million, a number well within the range of current scholarly estimates. That is 45 million people dead within 100 years from a population that had taken 15,000 years to build. There is no comparison in recorded history. The Black Death killed roughly a third of Europe's population in the 14th century, and it is remembered as the defining catastrophe of European civilization. The demographic collapse of the Americas killed 3 times that proportion across a population spread across 2 continents, in roughly the same time frame. And it happened largely in silence, recorded only in fragments, processed only gradually by subsequent generations, and for centuries almost entirely absent from the story that the Americas told about themselves. It is the largest human catastrophe that most people alive today know almost nothing about. The death toll was only the beginning of what was lost. Language is the vessel in which a civilization's knowledge travels through time. In 1492, the Americas were home to somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 distinct languages, more linguistic diversity than existed in all of Europe, Asia, and Africa combined. Each of those languages was not simply a different way of saying the same things. Each was a distinct cognitive framework, a unique way of organizing perception, describing the natural world, encoding social relationships, and preserving the accumulated knowledge of a people across generations. By the end of the colonial period, hundreds of those languages had vanished entirely. Not transformed, not replaced gradually, as speakers shifted to more widely useful tongues. Vanished. The last speaker died, and with them, everything encoded in that language that had not been written down or memorized by someone who survived. What was lost in those vanished languages is incalculable. Agricultural knowledge, medical knowledge, ecological knowledge accumulated over thousands of years of living in intimate relationship with specific landscapes and specific plant and animal communities. Astronomical observations, historical records, stories, philosophy, ways of understanding the relationship between human beings and the natural world that the surviving scientific tradition has been slowly and incompletely reconstructing at great expense and effort for the past several decades. The burning of the Maya codices by Bishop Diego de Landa in July of 1562 stands as one of the most consequential single acts of cultural destruction in history. Landa, a Franciscan missionary in the Yucatan, had become convinced that the Maya books were instruments of the devil, preserving traditions and beliefs that stood in the way of Christian conversion. He organized a great auto de fe at the town of Mani, at which 27 Maya codices, bark paper books containing centuries of accumulated astronomical, mathematical, agricultural, historical, and ritual knowledge, were burned. Landa wrote afterward that the Maya showed great sorrow at this. He seemed to find their sorrow puzzling. Of the thousands of Maya books that existed at the time of the conquest, for survived the colonial period, 4. The rest were burned, rotted in the tropical humidity, or deliberately destroyed as idolatrous objects by missionaries who did not understand what they were eliminating and would not have cared if they had. What those lost books contained, we will never fully know. We know, from the 4 survivors, that the Maya books included astronomical almanacs of startling precision, ritual calendars of great complexity, and historical narratives of an entire civilization's past. The 4 survivors have absorbed centuries of scholarly attention and yielded extraordinary insights. The 27 burned at Mani, and the thousands of others lost through the colonial period, are a silence that grows deeper the more you think about it. And yet the story did not end in 1492. It did not end in 1521 when Tenochtitlan fell. It did not end in 1532 when Pizarro captured the Inca emperor Atahualpa. It did not end in 1562 when the codices burned at Mani. It did not end in the long centuries of colonialism, forced labor, religious suppression, cultural erasure, and deliberate dismantling of indigenous social structures that followed. The story continued. It continues today. The peoples of the Americas survived. Not all of them. Not in the numbers that had existed before contact. Not with all of their knowledge and all of their languages and all of their institutions intact. But they survived. With a tenacity, a creativity, and a determination that is, when you look at it honestly, as remarkable as any of the architectural or intellectual achievements we have explored in this documentary. Languages survived. Not all of them, but hundreds. Today, more than 1,000 indigenous languages are still spoken in the Americas, from Navajo in the American Southwest to Quechua in the Andes, from Maya in the Yucatan to Guarani in Paraguay. Many of these languages are endangered. Some are spoken by only a handful of elders, but they are alive. And linguists, anthropologists, and the communities themselves are working with increasing urgency to document, revitalize, and transmit them to new generations. Agricultural practices survived. The Three Sisters still grow in indigenous gardens across North America. Andean farmers still maintain terraced fields that their ancestors built 1,000 years ago, managing them with the same knowledge of microclimates and frost behavior that those original builders understood. Chinampa agriculture persists in the lakes and canals of the Mexico City suburb of Xochimilco, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, where families still farm floating gardens using techniques developed in the Valley of Mexico before the foundation of Tenochtitlan. The dark earth of the Amazon, Terra Preta, is being studied with intense interest by modern soil scientists and agricultural researchers who understand that the principles behind its creation may hold some of the answers to the challenge of feeding a growing world without destroying the ecological systems that make agriculture possible. Ceremonial and spiritual traditions survived, not unchanged. Nothing survives centuries of oppression unchanged. But the core of practices, beliefs, and relationships with a natural and spiritual world that defined indigenous ceremonial life persisted through every attempt to extinguish it. The Day of the Dead in Mexico, which draws millions of participants and global attention, is a direct continuity with pre-Columbian Aztec practices for honoring and communicating with the dead, layered over Christian calendar dates, but rooted in something far older and far deeper. Across the indigenous communities of North and South America, ceremonies that were practiced in secret during the centuries when they were illegal under colonial law are now practiced openly, in public, by communities asserting their right to their own heritage with a determination that deserves more than admiration. The descendants of the civilizations we have explored in this documentary are not footnotes to history. They are not museum exhibits. They are not the sad remnant of a world that is gone. They are the continuation of a story that began 15,000 years ago on this continent and that is still being written by the Quechua communities of Peru maintaining their ancestral terrace farms, by the Maya scholars deciphering the remaining codices and teaching the written language to a new generation, by the Lakota linguists building digital archives of their language, by the Haudenosaunee peoples asserting, in courts of law, their treaty rights on lands that the discovery doctrine told the world they had never meaningfully occupied, by the Cherokee Nation rebuilding educational and governmental institutions that were dismantled by force 200 years ago and are now thriving 200 years later. These are not stories of defeat. They are stories of an endurance so profound that it reshapes what the word endurance means. The myth of the empty wilderness did not die in 1492. It did not die in the 19th century, when scholars first began to challenge the low population estimates. It did not die in 2005, when Charles Mann's book reached the bestseller lists. It is alive today. It lives in a legal doctrine called the Discovery Doctrine, which remains embedded in United States federal Indian law, and which continues to influence court decisions about indigenous land rights in ways that trace directly back to the philosophical framework that Columbus's patrons used to justify taking what they found. It lives in the casual assumption, still surprisingly common, that the Americas before European contact were essentially empty of history. That history, real history, the kind that matters, began when Europeans arrived. It lives in the school curricula that still devote more time to Columbus's voyage than to the civilizations he encountered. It lives in the political rhetoric that treats indigenous land rights as ancient grievances with no present relevance, rather than as ongoing legal and moral questions rooted in specific, documented acts of dispossession. It lives in the landscapes of North America, where the earthworks and mounds and trails of pre-Columbian civilization are routinely destroyed by development, often without any archaeological assessment, because the cultural and legal framework that might protect them has never fully absorbed the reality of what they represent. The myth is not merely a historical error. It has consequences. It has consequences right now in the legal status of tribal nations, in the sovereignty of indigenous communities, in the treatment of sacred sites, in the funding of archaeology and language revitalization, and in the stories that a nation tells its children about whose land they're standing on and what happened to the people who were there first. Understanding the truth, the actual evidential, archaeological, demographic truth about the Americas before 1492, is not an academic exercise. It is not a matter of being politically correct or of replacing one set of myths with another. It is a matter of honesty. And the implications of that honesty reach into every corner of American life, law, and self-understanding. Modern science is giving us tools to see the pre-Columbian Americas with a clarity that was impossible a generation ago. LiDAR is stripping the jungle canopy from lost cities. Genetic analysis is tracking the movements of ancient peoples across the continent with a precision that no amount of traditional archaeology could achieve. Environmental archaeology is reading the history of human land use in the pollen records of lake sediments and the charcoal layers of soil profiles, reconstructing thousands of years of agricultural practice from evidence invisible to the naked eye. Isotope analysis of ancient human bones is revealing where individuals grew up, what they ate, and how far they traveled. And in doing so, fleshing out the trade networks and population movements that shaped the pre-Columbian world. And perhaps most importantly, the oral traditions and indigenous knowledge systems of the peoples who survived the catastrophe are being recognized slowly and imperfectly, but increasingly, as legitimate historical sources. For centuries, the stories that indigenous peoples told about their own past were dismissed by Western scholarship as myth, as legend, as unreliable oral tradition unworthy of serious historical consideration. That dismissal was itself an act of epistemic colonialism. The same impulse that built the myth of the empty wilderness applied now to the intellectual domain rather than the territorial one. Indigenous oral traditions have been proved accurate in specific and verifiable ways about geological events, migration routes, ecological changes, and historical encounters that occurred hundreds and sometimes thousands of years in the past. The stories that the Ojibwe people tell about copper mining on the shores of Lake Superior align with the archaeological record of ancient copper extraction going back 5,000 years. The oral histories of the Muskogee people encode memories of the great Mississippian towns and their ceremonial practices in ways that correspond with archaeological findings. The knowledge held by Amazonian communities about the properties of specific plants, the behavior of specific soils, and the management of specific forest ecosystems is not primitive superstition. It is applied ecology, accumulated over thousands of years of intimate relationship with a specific landscape, and it is increasingly sought out by environmental scientists and conservationists who understand that their own traditions have not been accumulating knowledge of the Amazon for nearly long enough to understand it fully. The future of understanding the pre-Columbian Americas lies in the collaboration between the tools of Western science and the knowledge traditions of the peoples who never stopped carrying the memory of that world. That collaboration is happening. It is producing extraordinary results. And it is the most honest and the most productive approach to the great project of seeing what was really there. Columbus arrived on October the 12th, 1492. He stepped onto a beach in the Bahamas, planted a flag, and claimed the land for Spain. He named the island San Salvador. The people who were already there had their own name for it. He didn't ask what it was. That moment, the planting of the flag, the claiming of the land, the naming of a place that already had a name, is the founding gesture of the world we live in today. It is the moment from which the legal, political, and cultural architecture of the modern Americas traces its origins. And it was built from the very first second on a fiction. The fiction that this was discovery. The fiction that the land was, in any meaningful sense, there for the claiming. The fiction that the tens of millions of people living on that land, in their cities, and their farms, and their trade networks, and their ceremonial centers, did not constitute civilization in any form that European law or European conscience was required to recognize or respect. That fiction has had a very long run. It has shaped continents. It has built nations. It has made some people enormously wealthy and destroyed the worlds of many millions of others. And it has, for 500 years, been so deeply embedded in the story that the Americas tell about themselves that questioning it is felt, to many people, like an act of dangerous radicalism rather than an act of simple honesty. But here's what honesty looks like, stripped of politics and ideology and the weight of a nation's need to believe well of itself. Before Columbus, the Americas were home to some of the greatest cities ever built, to road systems that rivaled Rome, to agricultural innovations that would go on to feed the world, to astronomical observations that surpassed the European science of the same era, to languages in the thousands and knowledge systems of extraordinary depth and complexity, to tens of millions of human beings living full, rich, complicated, historically specific human lives in a world of their own making. Columbus did not discover that world. He did not understand it. He did not see it for what it was. And the civilization that followed in his wake did not, for the most part, try to understand it either. It tried to replace it. What we owe to the truth of what was there is not guilt. Guilt, unmoored from action, is the most self-indulgent of responses to historical injustice. What we owe is attention. Honest, sustained, humble attention to the full reality of what the Americas were, what was lost, what survived, and what is still at stake. What was built here, before the ships came, was extraordinary. It deserves to be seen, not through the eyes of the people who arrived to conquer it, not through the lens of the myth that was built to justify its destruction, but clearly, directly, as it actually was. 15,000 years of human presence on this continent, hundreds of distinct civilizations, tens of millions of people, cities that stopped hardened soldiers in their tracks, trade routes that crossed continents, dark earth and floating gardens, and knotted strings that counted the census of an empire. The zero, the calendar, the quipu, the road, the feathered headdress, and the suspension bridge, and the terraced mountainside, and the mound rising above the Mississippi floodplain larger at its base than the Great Pyramid of Giza. This was the America Columbus never found. It was here the whole time, and now that you have seen it, it cannot be unseen. If this documentary has changed the way you see this continent and its history, share it with someone who needs to see it too. Stories this important travel furthest when the people who care about them carry them forward. Take a moment to like this video and subscribe to this channel, because the history that has been hidden from us is vast, and we have only just begun to uncover it together. The next chapter of this story is waiting, and it is every bit as remarkable as the one you just heard.